Quick question, what was the biggest ally of the United States in the Middle East of the 1970s? You might think Israel, maybe Egypt, maybe Saudi Arabia, and you would be wrong. The single most loyal ally of the US in the region was Iran, which might surprise you quite a bit because nowadays the US and Iran have adversarial relationships. Well, stay tuned as we explore the history of US and Iranian relations since the 1950s. Before we delve into the history of Iran, let's spend a bit of time talking about the society and the geography of Iran. Here's a country that is also referred to as Persia in ancient times, same country, and that is quite distinct from the rest of the Middle East. As seen from the United States, oftentimes there's a tendency to kind of look at the whole region as being quite identical, but it's actually a region with a great amount of diversity, especially when it comes to Iran, which is very much the odd man out. For one thing, the people living in Iran are not Arabic. They are not from the same ethnic group as the rest of the Middle East. They would be Persian. And don't ever tell a Persian that they're Arab. They're not Arab, and I'll let you know about that very quickly. The language is also different. The majority of people in the Middle East will be speaking the Arabic language, the one that the Quran was written in. Well, the people of Iran, most of them will be speaking a different language, Persian, also known as Farsi. Religiously, there is also a difference. In Iran, there's an old religion called Zoroastrianism, which goes back all the way to the prophet Zarathustra in the times of ancient Persia, and still has a few followers in Iran to the present time. Not that many. Nowadays, Islam would be more dominant in Iran, but even then, it's a very specific branch of Islam. The bulk of the people who are of the Muslim faith worldwide would be of the Sunni background. This is the case of Egypt, or of Algeria, or Saudi Arabia, or just the world in general. But there's also a minority branch called Shiite Islam, also known as Shia Islam. And they tend to be a minority in the world. The split goes all the way back to the legacy right after Muhammad died, and there was a feud as to how you would split his inheritance and decide who would be in charge of the Muslim faith after the passing of the Prophet Muhammad. But whatever the schism was about, it left the Shiites as losers in that schism, and that's why they're a minority ever since. Except in a few areas of the Middle East where they tend to be a majority in those spots. Some places in Afghanistan, along the Persian Gulf, like southern Iraq, places like Qatar, Dubai have big Shiite minorities, and Iran, which is the single largest Shiite country in the world. So that also puts them at odds with the rest of the Middle East, which is majority Sunni when they are Shiites. And because that feud goes back hundreds of years, and there's a sense of persecution among the Shiites that they were robbed of their inheritance after the death of Muhammad, they have a sense of being martyred or being persecuted by the rest of the region. So in many ways, Iran is quite singular compared with the rest of the Middle East. Beyond that, the history of Iran is quite similar to what we have identified as a general pattern in the region. One of a golden age in the distant past, and a more recent decline, and then a big debate as to what would be the proper way forward. In terms of the golden age of Iran, well, you would go back to ancient Persia, when during the antiquity in the Middle East, one of the great empires, one that would be rivaling Egypt or Rome in size, would be the Empire of Persia, which for a while controlled pretty much the entirety of the Middle East. That's the same Persian Empire that fought all these wars against the Greeks at Marathon, or fought against Alexander the Great. And it's a long-lasting empire, roughly 600 BC to 600 AD, with some magnificent achievements to its name and the capital of Persepolis, and plenty of great things to be proud of if you are Iranian. However, that empire did not remain strong forever. By the Middle Ages, Persia was home to the Safavid Empire, and we didn't focus much on it in the class, but it would be very similar to the Ottoman Empire of the Turks to the west, or the Mughal Empire in India to the east, in the sense that all these Muslim empires tended to miss out on the Industrial Revolution in the 16, 17, 1800s and kind of slide behind the rest of the world. So that by the 1800s, Persia was just a shadow of its former self. It was still independent, but it had become the site of power struggles between the British and the Russians. The Russians were expanding in Central Asia, trying to move south towards more tropical waters, and the British that control India were trying to move north in order to keep the Russians at bay. That dispute for the domination of Central Asia was known as the Great Game. Well, Persia would be smack in the middle of it, and as a result was kind of split into areas of influence between the Russian that would control the north and the British that controlled the south. It never quite became a colony, but it was more like a protectorate or divided into spheres of influence, not fully independent. And that lasted into the 20th century, where you still had a lot of influence from Britain, Russia, and eventually the United States throughout World War I and World War II. So that's the kind of situation that Iran was in coming out of World War I and then World War II. A once proud empire, but one that had missed out on the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and was just a shadow of its former self. So how do you go forward? Well, the main answer would be oil, because in the 20th century, much oil is discovered in the Middle East, including around the Persian Gulf, and Iran is one of the largest producers of oil in the world. That oil, however, was produced by mostly British oil companies, to some extent American, in a way that was neo-colonial in a way, that the engineering expertise, the capital was provided by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or British Petroleum, in exchange for which the Iranians would allow them to operate and then just collect royalties. Kind of the same neo-colonial relationship that we've observed in Guatemala under the United Fruit Company, or under the reign of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, and on and on and on. We've seen many examples like that. Many Iranians were aware of that, and the Iranians seem to be extremely patriotic, extremely nationalistic, and that bothered them to see the oil being exploited by a foreign company, especially Britain, a quasi-colonial ruler. So there was one political figure, his name was Mossadegh, who in the 1950s made a big argument that the oil ought to be nationalized. When he announced that he would do that, he bumped into important enemies, meaning British or American oil companies that were making money hand over fist in Iran. And so in 1953, the British Secret Services, as well as the American CIA, kind of conspired together to overthrow Mossadegh, who was accused of going against the interests of major American and British corporations, and also being a bit pinkish. This being the Cold War, any person that was to the left was accused of being a stooge of the Soviet Union. And so this man that was very popular was ousted from Iran. That's an event that you probably have never heard of if you're American. It is well remembered in Iran. That's one of the reasons why the country does not like the US too much. The US and Britain meddled into the internal affairs of Iran in that 1953 coup. The person that really came to the fore after the ouster of Mossadegh was one ruler that was far more favorable to the US and Britain, and that would be a man called Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who is usually referred to as the Shah of Iran. And Shah simply means the emperor of Iran, but usually when people nowadays speak of the Shah of Iran, they mean the last of them, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He, in contrast with Mossadegh, was very, very closely aligned with the US and Britain, and willing to allow them to continue drilling for oil as long as they paid royalties to him, and also joined as a strong ally of the US in the Cold War, and Iran being strategically located next to oil fields and to the south of Russia would be a very important ally to have in the region. So you have a kind of a symbiotic relationship with the US and Britain would prop up the regime of the Shah, providing with weapons, diplomatic assistance, in exchange for which he would give them an important alliance against Russia and also access to the oil fields of Iran. The Shah of Iran was quite popular in the West, in part because he was a strong ally during the Cold War, also because, in contrast with a lot of the rest of the Middle East, he tended to be pro-Israeli. His regime was a secular one that was not aligned with the Shiite church or the Zoroastrian church, and instead tried to have some more separation of church and state. And that extended to diplomacy, where we close to some majority Christian nations like the US and Britain, or majority Jewish nation like Israel. That also extended to the rights of women, who tended to be quite freer in Iran and the rest of the Middle East as of the 1960s and 70s. Quite a few of them went to college, studied science or medicine or fields that would be more traditionally reserved for men, and generally did quite well. And the wife of the Shah of Iran appeared in public without wearing a veil, which was unprecedented in Iran. And generally there's a desire to promote a more egalitarian vision for women and an access to Western culture in general. Every American movie could play in Tehran, you could drink alcohol. It's a very, very westernized country, which played well in the US, but not always with the more religious figures in Iran that were very critical of it. I don't want to emphasize too much how positive the Shah was, because he had some faults that tend to be forgotten in the United States. For one thing, the fact that he gave away a lot of the oil revenue to foreign companies would be poorly perceived in Iran. And then with that money, what did he do? Well, to a large extent, he bought American weapons because he was a dictator and that was a way to prop up his regime. And for a while in the 1970s, the single largest purchaser of weapons in the world from the United States was Iran, after the US Army, of course. So that was a major market for American goods, specifically weapons. So in a way, the oil is produced in Iran by American companies. A lot of money goes to the US as profits. Some of it remains as royalties, but then ends up in the US anyway because those royalties are used to buy American weapons. Meanwhile, most people in Iran would be rather poor. There is a lot of oil in Iran, but also a large population. So when you divide the pie between a lot of people, the slice can be quite small. So a lot of the money that would be made in Iran would go to the United States either directly or indirectly. A lot of it also went to the pockets of the Shah, who lived a life of incredible luxury. Specifically, there's a moment in the 70s when he and his wife wanted to celebrate what I think was the 2,500-year anniversary of the time when there were Shahs, there were emperors in Persia, going all the way back to the ancient Persia. So they had a magnificent party for that, inviting head of state from all around the world. Incredible celebration that cost a fortune, and mostly were catered to an international audience because a lot of the guests were foreigners or rich people from Iran. To allow the local people to participate vicariously, the Shah decided to have the whole event televised on television. So you have to imagine living in the remote corner of Iran, an area that might not have access to reliable electricity or running water. And so all the villagers would gather up in the one house that does have electricity and has a little black and white TV, and they can see all these incredible celebrations going on there. And you start wondering, well, is the money being well spent? Maybe it would be better to spend it on having a good water supply in the village so that my daughter doesn't die of diarrhea, as opposed to having all these fancy celebrations for the rich and foreigners. So that's one issue. Even in the 1970s, when the price of oil doubled after the Yom Kippur War, and there's a lot of oil money flowing to Iran, although not always to the right place. Beyond that, all of this secular, nationalistic, pro-development policy was done within an authoritarian bent. The Shah of Iran came to power mostly with the support of outsiders and is not elected. He is an emperor by virtue of his birth. And so that limited the democratic environment that you could have in Iran. Specifically, if you ever dare to complain against the Shah, that would be a very dangerous business to be in, say to be an editorialist in the paper. If you ever dare to write an editorial complaining about how the oil money went into the wrong hands, there's a very strong likelihood that the Savak, which was a secret police, would come knocking at your door the next day, pick you up, and then take you to prison, and you would never be heard from again, possibly tortured or executed simply for political crime. So there's a big downside to the rule of the Shah. This eventually led to a series of demonstrations in 1979 in Tehran, the capital, which eventually do even more demonstration and more demonstration, no matter how hard the Savak tried to crush a few skulls and restrain those demonstrations. Things got so bad that eventually the Shah of Iran had to abdicate and leave the country under the face of what was a popular uprising. This was not a very good time for him. As it turned out, he was diagnosed with cancer and eventually went to the United States in order to get some treatment and, well, spoiler alert, eventually died there. So that's what ended what had been a long period where Iran was a very pro-American ally in the region and pursuing a very pro-Western policy of granting more rights to women, working closely with foreign corporations, except for the democratic aspect. So what will happen after that? If Iran tried the secular authoritarian policy, will it then try democratization or maybe go to a Muslim fundamentalist state? Well, we'll know next time as we study the history of Iran from 1979 all the way to the present.